Thank you. Good afternoon to you all. The study we presented just now is a first-of-type study looking at a different approach to the prevention of heart failure. Heart failure remains in an era where we're getting on top of a lot of cardiovascular diseases. Heart failure remains a major public health problem. The prevalence of the condition is climbing, and whereas we have good treatment once people develop heart failure, the problem is that the best approach will always remain, like in many chronic diseases, an effective prevention strategy. Up to today, our prevention strategies have been, to a degree, successful, but not as successful as we need, as evidenced by the fact that the prevalence of the condition is still climbing. And that's probably because the risk-predicting models that we use to try and pick out the individuals at risk for heart failure, while good, are not as sharp as we'd like them and don't allow us to focus in as effectively as we'd like on the people who are truly at risk. We have tools that make these present-day risk stratifications more effective, and the purpose of the STOP-HF project then was to take the standard risk identifiers, but to supplement it with a tool that would allow us to be more specific regarding the individuals who are truly at risk. And the tool we used is Natriuretic peptide, which is a protein secreted in the body when the cardiovascular system gets under stress. And it's a peptide that we use in many other cardiovascular conditions, and indeed we use it in established heart failure. But in this particular project, we're bringing it back into the era or into the phase of prevention of heart failure. And we know from excellent supportive data, which has been gathered over the last 10 years from notable cohorts such as the Olmsted County cohort in Minnesota, as well as the Framingham cohort, as well as cohorts in Europe, that this particular peptide, above and beyond the standard risk factors, identifies risk for heart failure. So what we set out to do in a manner that we felt was very pragmatic, because we wanted this study to be very applicable to routine care in the community, is we liaised with approximately 40 primary care practices in the Dublin area in Ireland and also in the area just south of Dublin. And we linked in with these primary care practices to get the true community patient at risk for heart failure. And what we did is we randomized the patients to routine ongoing care with a primary care physician, or an arm where Natriuretic peptide was available to help us risk stratify. And in the arm where Natriuretic peptide was available to risk stratify, the plan of the study was to take individuals where that peptide was above a certain level, 50 picograms per mil, which is a level that we'd all agree is above the norm and does define risk. And in those individuals who were above that level, we took them into the cardiology service in our hospital and went through a formatted approach to try and identify elements of their cardiovascular history or status that we could modify to try and help their outlook. But it's important to stress that the intervention is as much a structure of care as it is any defined intervention. We're bringing patients in, we're identifying to the patient and to the physicians looking after them that their risk status is heightened, as evidenced by the Natriuretic peptide. And we were able to compare the outcome in that group with the outcome in the group that did not have Natriuretic peptide-directed care. The endpoint we looked at was the development of heart failure over the lifetime of the study, as well as the development of asymptomatic heart dysfunction, because we know once you develop a significant degree of asymptomatic heart dysfunction, you're likely to go down the track to heart failure. So that was the primary endpoint. But because Natriuretic peptide, this peptide that we were using to triage risk, also identifies risk for other cardiovascular problems, our major secondary endpoint was the development of hospitalization for other major cardiovascular causes. Over a follow-up period of 4.2 years, we were able to show that in the Natriuretic peptide-directed care, that there was a 37% reduction in the primary endpoint, which was seen in all of the three components of the primary endpoint. In other words, new onset heart failure and two different types of heart dysfunction that we were following. The impact on the primary endpoint was predominantly in the subgroup that had a Natriuretic peptide level above 50. So again, that comes back to support the hypothesis that the Natriuretic peptide level at that point can help us triage or look effectively at the individual truly at risk. So a positive endpoint, a positive impact on the primary endpoint in this study. But interestingly as well, and again supported by the background data on Natriuretic peptide, is that individuals who were managed with the availability of Natriuretic peptide also had a significant reduction in cardiovascular hospitalizations, the secondary endpoint. There was about a 40% reduction in the development of hospitalizations for cardiovascular causes throughout the course of the study. So the impact of this study is that it tells us, and again this is a first of type study, that using natriuretic peptide to support modern day risk stratification for heart failure, but to take it a little bit further with natriuretic peptide, brings about a significant impact on the development of new onset heart failure as well as heart dysfunction. But in addition to that, also is associated with a reduction in cardiovascular admissions to hospital for other cardiovascular causes. And it does open up the possibility of bringing in a more effective strategy to prevent the condition that still is growing in prevalence. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Cole.
Thank you. Again, I want to congratulate the investigator on conducting this trial. Pragmatic design and addresses an unmet need. As you know, BNP is not routinely recommended by guidelines for screening. And perhaps this may be the first step in getting the guideline committees to at least address this issue. I think the trial obviously met all of its endpoints and probably related to intensification of disease-modifying therapies, particularly the angiotensin antagonist, aldosterone antagonist, and ACE inhibitor therapy. There was a significant difference in the reduction in blood pressure, systolic blood pressure from baseline. That may have to some degree contributed to it. I think the investigators have acknowledged some of the limitations of this study. It's an open label design. The endpoints were not adjudicated, and it's based on a single center study in a homogeneous healthcare environment. I'd like to focus on what I think is the key limitation of this study, which in my opinion, it doesn't invalidate the results, but it certainly challenges the interpretation, and that's missing data. About 10% of patients were lost to follow-up, and about 23 to 30% had withdrawn their consent. I did not attend your lecture at the late-breaking trials. I don't know how you addressed that, but I just wanted to bring your attention to that this is a vexing problem. FDA is increasingly sensitized to this issue. And just recently, last week, one of the anticoagulants was rejected because one of the key problems was the missing data. And they had a missing data of about 8%. They went back and tried to get the remaining data, and the residual missing data was still 3.1%. So it challenges the interpretation of the results of this. And you will have to do some sensitivity analysis where you sort of impute for that missing data. My guess is that the results will still hold, but it remains to be seen. Congratulations again.
Thank you, Sanjay. I also have a couple of questions about the trial. Was the echo data core lab assessed, or was it done by the practitioner?
The echo was done in the center, the single referral center in St. Vincent's Hospital. So there was echo done by blinded technicians read blindly to study intervention. Not a core lab, but equivalent to a core lab. Can I come back and address the other questions?
Absolutely.
I just wanted to come back because I think it's a very important point about the loss to follow-up data. I think it's a feature of pragmatic studies, and that's not to hide behind the observation, but I think it is an important feature. The loss to follow-up were 60 in each arm, which wasn't an extraordinary amount, but the withdrew consent group was where there was a difference between the two populations. There were 130 patients that withdrew consent in the routine arm, and it was 70 or 80 in the intervention arm. We feel this is because when the study was explained to patients, that they were enthusiastic about entering because it may have provided an opportunity to get cardiovascular review, and then when they were randomized to the routine arm, their enthusiasm for the study may have lessened. The second issue, however, is when you look at the BNP of the withdrawals, the BNP for the people that withdrew in the routine arm was higher than the BNP for those that withdrew in the intervention arm. suggesting that this withdrawal may have biased towards equivalence in the study. And finally, we did take your advice there about multiple imputations, and that form of statistical analysis led us to the same result. So I do agree with you, having that many withdrawal consent and some loss to follow-up does make the study a little bit more complex in interpreting, but in some respects I think that population almost biased us towards equivalence in the data overall.
Just so I'm sure I got this correct. So if your BNP was over 50, you then get referred to a cardiovascular specialist, right? So I have a little bit of a problem. What's more potent, a BNP level or getting referred to a doctor that's a cardiovascular specialist? As a cardiologist, I might think I might be smarter than the BNP. In other words, so it's hard to know if you follow. Some people are getting followed by cardiologists, others aren't.
Yeah.
Only the BNP group are.
That's true.
So that, I think, could lead to some bias on hospitalization, mortality, focus. And then the other bias is, and we do this all the time, we have a patient and they don't want to take a lipid-lowering drug, let's say. We show them their CT scan, it has coronary calcium, they become much more compliant. If you have a patient who maybe is or isn't taking their medication and they know they have a high BNP, maybe that's why the lipids came under better control, as you alluded to, because maybe they became more compliant with their statins. Those are two issues.
Can I just add one comment? I did not see the data, but I was kind of impressed by the fact that 75% of the events in the control arm occurred in those that had BNP levels over 50. Have you done any analysis to look at what the discriminant value of this at such a low level of 50 is in these patients? Because just by crude analysis, it looks like a risk ratio of 3.
I'm not quite sure I understand. I mean, we will be, 25% of the population did hit the endpoint without ever going across the 50 BNP mark.
Right, and 75, so you could do 75 divided by 25.
Yes, so that analysis is yet to be done. It's an important analysis. But the other issue, I think it just speaks to the fact that the cutoff that we use is probably a little on the high side. But again, it's going to be a balance when you look at the cost effectiveness of this. The lower you bring the natriuretic peptide level, the more you're going to need to screen. And comes back to the point about the cardiology service. Right. I don't think this is solely the cardiologist involved. I think it is, as you point out, that what we're doing is we're making the patient aware and making the physician aware, including the primary care physician, that you're not dealing with a routine hypertensive, for example, anymore. You're dealing with a routine hypertensive with a natriuretic peptide signal. The analogy I used during the late breaker was this is like the disease management structure we've been using now for several years in the more severe heart failure, where the intervention is multidimensional and it's difficult to pinpoint exactly what's bringing the benefit. I think what we're doing here is bringing the same disease management project back into phase A, phase B heart failure by the criteria in the ACC and HA. And I think similarly the intervention is multidimensional and probably difficult to dissociate out what is critical.
So you're really recruiting earlier intervention in a way.
Yes.
Maybe another way of stating. Well, thank you very much. Excellent. Our next